Main text of Zhang Ailing's Half-Life Chapter 9. Shijin made up his mind on that stormy night and would never go to Manzan's house again, but this type of determination is of little value. After all, the stimulation he received was just due to a few words from her mother and had nothing to do with her. Even if she herself has different aspiration, based on their past friendship, she can't just let it go. She must at least meet once and talk things through. Shijin thought he had figured it out, but he didn't know why. But it was delayed for another day. In fact, staying there for one more day would only make him sleepless for one more night. The next day, he ran to the head office to find Manzan during office hours. Since Shu Hui left, another person was transferred to Manzan's office, and it was not convenient to talk. Shijin didn't come often, so as not to attract attention. On this day, he simply said to her, "How about we go out for dinner tonight? It's in a cafe not far from Yang's house. It's very convenient for you to teach there after dinner." Manzan said, "I'm not going to teach today. The two children are going to have a wedding banquet. They told me yesterday." Shijin said, "It's better if you don't go to teach. We can talk for a while. Find another place to eat. That's okay." Manzan smiled and said, "You'd better come to my house for dinner. You haven't been here for a long time." Shijin paused and said, "Who said that? I just came here the day before yesterday." Manzan was very surprised, said, "Oh, why didn't they tell me?" Shijin said nothing. Seeing this situation, Manzan guessed that he must have been wronged. It was not convenient to go into detail at that time, so I just smiled and said, "I happened to go out the day before yesterday. My brother was acting in the school. It was the first time for Jimin to go on stage. I had no choice but to go and cheer him up. When I came back, it was raining heavily. A few people we all caught a cold. You passed it to me, I passed it to you. And the whole family caught a cold. Don't go out to eat in restaurants today. I can't eat anything too greasy. My voice is going hoarse just because you heard it." Shijin, it was because of the slight sandy sound in her throat that she had a sad and charming look. He then agreed to come to her house for dinner. He came to her house at dusk. Before he got halfway up the stairs, the light on the stairs came on. It was her mother who turned on the light upstairs. At the entrance of the stairs, there was still the same as the day before yesterday. There was a briquette stove with a casserole on it. The smell of ham soup was very strong in the air. Shijin had eaten at their house many times. Mrs. Gu knew his taste. This dish was probably specially made for him. Why did Mrs. Gu change her attitude and suddenly become so attentive to him? Manzan must have said something to her, which made Shijin feel a little embarrassed. Mrs. Gu seemed a little embarrassed. She nodded to him with a smile and said, "Manzan is in there." After saying this, she went to take care of the ham soup. Shijin walked into the room and saw Mrs. Gu sitting there peeling watercress. The old lady also smiled when she saw him, pouted towards Manzan's bedroom and said, "Manzan is in there." When they came here, Shijin felt a little uneasy. Walking in, Manzan was leaning on the windowsill and looking down. Shijin quietly walked up behind her, grabbed one of her wrists, and said with a smile, "What are you looking at? You're so fascinated." Manzan said with a cry, "I was shocked. I've been watching here for a long time. Why didn't I see you when you came?" Shijin said with a smile, "Maybe I missed it in a blink of an eye." He kept holding her hand. "Let go," Manzan said. "Why don't you come these days?" Shijin smiled and said, "I'm always busy." Manzan curled her lips at him. Shijin smiled and said, "Really, Shu Hui has a sister who is studying in the mainland. She recently came to Shanghai to take the school entrance examination and needs to take tutoring in arithmetic. Shu Hui doesn't live at home now, so this job falls on me. 2 hours of tutoring after dinner every day." "Where is Yujin?" Manzan said. "He has already left. He left today." Shijin said. "Oh." He sat down on Manzan's bed and just looked at the lamp by her bed was turned on and off. Manzan slapped his hand and said, "Don't do that. It's broken. Let me ask you, what did your mother say to you when you came the day before yesterday?" Shijin smiled and said, "I didn't say anything." Manzan said with a smile. Jin smiled and said, "That's why you don't confess. It's because I didn't confess to my mother that you were wronged." Shijin smiled and said, What are you wronging me for? Manzin said with a smile. You just don't care. Anyway, I have already explained it to her. And now she knows that she has wronged a good person. Shijin smiled and said, Oh, I know, she must think that I am not sincere to you. Manzin said with a smile. Why? Did you hear what she said? Shijin said with a smile. No, I didn't see her at all when I came that day. Manzin said, I don't believe it. Shijin said, It's true. That day your sister is here, right? Manzin nodded slightly. Shijin said, They were talking in the inner room. And I heard your mother say, he didn't want to say that her mother was snobbish. And after a pause, he said, I can't remember clearly. Anyway, that meant Eugen is an ideal son-in-law. Manzin smiled and said, Eugen may be an ideal son-in-law for old ladies. Shijin looked at her and smiled and said, I think he is a person who can be appreciated by both refined and popular people. Manzin glanced at him and said, If you don't mention it, I won't say it either. I'm about to settle a score with you. Shijin smiled and said, What? Manzin said, You think I'm with you? Jin is very good. Isn't he? You don't trust me like this. Shijin said with a smile. That's not the case. I was just joking. I know you just admire him. As for him, he is the most affectionate person. Man, how could he suddenly fall in love with your sister in just a few days after he has been so loyal to your sister all these years? There is no such thing. When he mentioned Eugen, he felt a little sour. Manzin originally wanted to. Jin simply told him how she proposed to her, so that he would not be left with such doubts. But she didn't want to say it, because she also felt that it was a bit surprising that Eugen had kept the festival for her sister for all these years, and suddenly fell in love with her. It also seemed a bit ridiculous to say it to Shijin. She didn't want him to be laughed at. She was somewhat protective of him. Seeing her hesitant to speak, Shijin felt a little strange and couldn't help but glance at her. He also fell silent. After a long while, he smiled and said, What your mother said is right. Manzin said with a smile. Which sentence? Shijin said with a smile. It is better to get married early. If this continues, misunderstandings will easily occur, Manzin said with a smile. Unless I won't be suspicious. For example, you just said that Shu Hui's sister. Shijin said with a smile. Shu Hui's sister? She is only 14 years old this year. Manzin said with a smile. I'm not asking around here, so don't think I mean it. Shijin smiled and said, Maybe you mean it. But Manzin got really angry and said, I won't talk to you. Come on. And ran away. Shijin pulled her and smiled and said, I'm telling you something serious. Manzin said, Didn't we already decide? We said we would wait for 2 more years. Shijin said, Actually, it's the same even if you get married. Can you still do things as usual? Manzin said, What if you have children? Once you have more children, you can't go out to do things, and you have to bear the expenses of the 2 families alone. I don't see this kind of thing. What's more, in addition to supporting the family, a man's father-in-law's family also relies on him, forcing him to grab money whenever he sees it and do anything. What future does that have? What are you laughing at? Shijin said with a smile. What are you going to do? How many children do you want? Manzin spat. I'm really ignoring you this time. Shijin said again. To be honest, I am not incapable of enduring hardship. Everyone suffers. You don't think about it for me. I see you working so hard. Don't I feel sad? Manzin said. It doesn't matter. She was always so stubborn. Shijin has said these words more than once. He fell silent gloomily. Manzin looked at his face and smiled. You must think I am very cold. Shijin suddenly pulled her into his arms and whispered, I know, if I have plans for you, I will definitely refuse. If it were all for me, for my selfish reasons, would you be willing? She did not answer his question, but just pushed him to prevent him from kissing her and said, I have a cold. Don't live it up. Shijin smiled and said, I also have a cold. Manzin chuckled and said, Stop talking nonsense. She let go of her hand and ran to the next room. Her grandmother's daubin was only half peeled. Manzin smiled and said, I'll help peel it. Shijin also came out. There was a desk behind her grandmother. Shijin leaned on the desk, picked up a newspaper, and pretended to read the newspaper. In fact, he was always looking at her and smiling at her. Manson sat there peeling beans, feeling a little uneasy. She finally felt a little shaken in her heart and thought, well, let's just get married. There are more people in the family. How do they live? Just thinking about it like this. She heard her grandmother yelling. She yelled and said, look! What are you doing? Manson was startled. When he looked, it turned out that she had left the pods on the table, but she was throwing the beans to the ground one by one. Her face turned red and she hurriedly knelt down to pick up the beans. She smiled and said, I call it Gurdoozy helps. The more you help, the more help you get. Her grandmother laughed and said, I haven't seen you like this either. While doing things, I don't even look at them. Manson laughed and said, I won't peel off a few more. My fingernails are cut bare from typing, and it really hurts to peel these beans. Her grandmother said, I knew you couldn't do it. He said and pulled away. Although Manson was shaken, Shijin didn't know that he was still a little depressed. After the meal, the old lady took out a pack of cigarettes for Shijin to smoke. They had just cleaned the room downstairs and found it in the drawer. The children wanted to smoke and play with it, but their mother did not allow it. At that moment, Shijin casually took one and sucked it. When the old lady laughed, he smiled at Manson and said, Eugen threw it here, right? He remembered that Eugen said that in the countryside, like this little fairy was already the best cigarette. I was used to smoking it, so I bought and smoked it even when I came to Shanghai. Probably he was also used to frugality. Shijin smoked his cigarette and talked about him with Manson again, but Manson was very reluctant to mention Eugen again. When she came home today, she found that Eugen had already arrived. She took her luggage and went straight to the station. She clearly deliberately avoided meeting her and would probably never come again. She rejected him and lost a friend like him. Although there was nothing she could do about it, she couldn't help but feel sad. Shijin saw the confused look on her face. He remembered that when the two of them were together some time ago, she often mentioned Eugen to many times, but now her attitude was just the opposite. She seemed to be afraid of mentioning him. Something must have happened in the meantime. She didn't tell her, and he didn't ask her. He had been a little depressed that day, and he went back early, with the excuse that he wanted to tutor Shu Hui's sister in arithmetic. Not long after he left, he suddenly heard the doorbell ringing again. Mrs. Gu and the others just thought they were the tenants downstairs and ignored it. Later, he heard footsteps on the stairs and shouted, Who is it? Shijin smiled and said, It's me. I'm here again. Mrs. Gu and the old lady, including Manson, were all astonished. They felt that he was too hot when he came twice a day. Manson's cheeks felt hot again. She felt that his behavior seemed a bit unreasonable. Isn't it embarrassing for her family to watch? But she is very happy in her heart, and she doesn't know why. Shijin stopped before he reached the door of the room and said with a smile, Have you gone to bed already? Mrs. Gu smiled and said, No, it's still early. When Shijin walked in, everyone in the room greeted him with smiles, with a hint of teasing. But when Manson saw a small suitcase in his hand, she was surprised at first. Then she saw that, although he had a smile on his face, he looked very uneasy. He smiled and said, I have to go back to Nanjing. It's the night train today. I thought I'd come here and say something. Manson said, Why are you leaving suddenly? Shijin said, There was a telegram just now, saying that my father is sick and asked me to go back. He stood there without putting down the box at all, as if he was not ready to sit down. Manson, like him, was a little confused and just stood there in a daze. It was Mrs. Gu who asked, What time does the bus leave? Shijin said, It's 11:30. Mrs. Gu said, That's still early. Sit down for a while. Sit down for a while. Shijin just sat down. Come down. Slowly take off your scarf and put it on the table. Mrs. Gu chatted and said she wanted to make tea, then walked away and called the other children out one by one. The old lady also walked away, leaving only him and Manson. Manson said, The telegram didn't say what kind of illness it was. Is it not serious? Shijin said, The telegram was from my mother. I think if it hadn't been serious, My mother would never have known that he was sick. Doesn't my father have another home? He always lives there. Manzin nodded, seeing that she hadn't spoken for a long time. Zhen knew that she must be worried that he wouldn't come back for a while, so he said, I always come back as soon as possible. The factory can't ask for more leave. Manzin nodded again. The last time he went back to Nanjing, their friendship was still shallow after all. This time it was the first time they tasted separation. Manzin took a long time to say a word and said, I don't know your home address yet. She immediately went to find paper and pen. Zhen said, no need to write. I will write a letter as soon as I get there. I will write it on the envelope, marked. Manzin said, let's write one. Zhen was leaning on the desk to write, and she was leaning on the other end of the desk, watching him write. Both of them felt a sense of desolation. After Zhen finished writing, he picked up the note, looked at it, and said with a smile, actually, I will be back in a few days, so there is no need to write a letter. Manzin didn't say anything. Just put his scarf twisted in your hands. Zhen looked at his watch, stood up and said, it's time for me to go, don't come out, you're catching a cold. Manzin said, it doesn't matter. She put on her coat and walked out with him. There was no iron bar door in the alley, but there were already few pedestrians on the street. I saw the rickshaws, both carrying passengers. Most of the houses along the street had their lights turned off, except for a tiger stove with its door wide open. Under the yellow electric light, you could see milky white steam coming out from under the dark wooden pot cover on the stove. As soon as I walked to the door of his house, it was warm. Night travelers can't help but feel a little nostalgic when they walk by here. The weather is getting really cold, and the nights are quite cold. Zhen said, I had no feelings for my father, but the last time I went back and saw him, I didn't know why, but it made me feel very sad. Manzin nodded and said, I heard what you said. Zhen said, also, what I'm most worried about is the financial situation of my family in the future. In fact, this is all expected, but I feel so confused. Manzin suddenly held his hand and said, I can't wait to go with you. I don't have to show up. I can just find a place to live. If something happens, you have someone beside you who can tell me at any time. Tell me. You should feel happy. Zhen looked at her and said with a smile, you see, you will know by now that it will be easier if you get married. So of course we will go back together, and you will not be alone. I'm thinking about it here. Manzin rolled her eyes at him and said, you still have the heart to say this, which shows that you are not really in a hurry. A rickshaw came from a distance. Zhen shouted, and the driver came across the street. Zhen suddenly remembered again and whispered to Manzin, no one will read my letter. You can write it longer. Manzin sneered and said, you don't mean that there is no need to write a letter. Are you coming back in a few days? I knew you were lying to me. Zhen also laughed. She stood under the street light and watched him go away. Early the next morning, when the train arrived in Nanjing, Zhen rushed home, but his shop was not open yet. He went in through the back door and saw the driver cleaning the chartered carriage. Zhen asked, Madam, have you gotten up? The driver said, get up. We will go over there soon. When he said the word over there, he gently turned his head to one side. Of course, over there is synonymous with the small mansion. Zhen's heart skipped a beat, and he thought, my father's illness will definitely not be cured, so my mother has to rush over there to see him. Thinking like this, his steps became heavy. The chartered cab driver was ahead of him and ran upstairs to report. Mrs. Shen came out to greet him and said with a smile, you came so quickly. I was talking to the eldest mistress and asked the cab driver to pick her up later. It must be noon. That bus. The eldest young lady and Xiao Jian were eating porridge there. She quickly got up and asked the maids to bring more bowls and chopsticks, and asked them to cut some sausages. Mrs. Shen said to Zhen, you can come with me after you have breakfast. Zhen said, how is Dad's illness? Mrs. Shen said, I have finally gotten better these 2 days. The first 2 days were not good. It was so scary. I didn't care anymore and ran to meet him. It looked wrong. My tongue was stiff, and I couldn't speak clearly. Now I get injections every day. And the doctor said I still need to rest well. And I can't speak clearly, am not out of danger yet. I go there every day now. His mother actually went to the small mansion every day to get along with her concubine and her mother-in-law, which Shijin simply couldn't imagine, especially because a woman like her mother asked her to stay in a cold home. No matter how hard it was, she could endure it. But she had her own identity, and her concept of a patriarchal society was very strong, and she would never fall down in front of concubines. Although it is said to be to take care of her husband's illness, but it's not like there's no one there to take care of her. It must be very unwelcome for her to go there, and it must be very painful for her. Shijin couldn't help but think of her mother, who always used a cold tone when talking about his father, mentioning his illness and the possibility of death. She was also very calm and said with a smile, "I don't worry about anything else. If we don't leave anything at home, how will we live in the future? If it weren't for this, it wouldn't matter to me if he died immediately. Anyway, I can't see him all year round, so I might as well die." The words are still in my ears. After breakfast, his mother went to his father's place with him. His mother took a chartered car and called another rickshaw for Shijin. Shijin arrived first, jumped out of the car, rang the bell, and a male servant came to open the door. He seemed surprised to see him and called out, "Second young master." Shijin walked in and saw his concubine's mother sitting in the guest room, braiding her granddaughter's hair. A maid squatted on the ground to tie the child's shoelaces. The concubine's mother was braiding her hair and said, "But the one from the drum tower is here? Don't move, Daddy is sick. Why don't you behave better? Mom Joe, take her for a walk, but don't let her eat blindly." Shijin thought, the one from the drum tower must be referring to my mother. Aren't we living in the drum tower? People are named after places. At this time, the one from the drum tower also came in. Shijin asked his mother to walk in front, and he followed behind and went upstairs together. This was the first time he looked at his mother through other people's eyes, seeing her bloated body and gloomy face. It was very difficult for her to climb the stairs, and she tried her best to appear calm and show that she was here to perform her vocation. Shijin never came upstairs. The furnishings in the bedroom upstairs still retained to some extent the style of my concubine's business trip in the past. The mahogany furniture is piled high in the hall, and some family touches are also added, such as light green Shilin cloth curtains and white window screens. Light green pink wall. Because there were patients in the room, it was a little messy. Zhao Tong slept alone on a double bed, and there was a small iron bed, which seemed to be a makeshift one. The concubine was leaning on Xiao Tong's bedside, feeding him orange juice with a small silver spoon and holding his head in her arms. Zhao Tong didn't know if he thought this was a kind of erotic performance. His wife walked in, and the concubine only raised her eyelids, gently greeted Madam, and continued to feed her orange water. Zhao Tong didn't even raise his eyelids. But Mrs. Shen smiled at him and said, "Look who's here." The concubine smiled and said, "Hey, the second young master is here." Shijin called Dad. Xiao Tong said with great difficulty, "Hey, you're here. How many days of leave did you ask for?" Mrs. Shen said, "Just stop talking. Didn't the doctor tell you to talk more?" Xiao Tong fell silent. The concubine put the small silver spoon to his lips again and touched him. But he shook his head in disgust and looked embarrassed at the same time. The concubine smiled and said, "Don't want to eat?" The more he behaved like this, the more she wanted to show off her tenderness and considerateness. She pulled down the white silk scarf tucked in her skirt, wiped his mouth, and then wiped his mouth. The pillows were moved and the quilt was pulled. Xiao Tong asked Shijin again, "When will you go back?" Mrs. Shen said, "Don't worry, he won't leave, as long as you don't talk too much." Xiao Tong was silent again. Shijin looked at his father and didn't really recognize him. Of course it was because of his weight loss, but also partly because his father was lying on the bed without glasses, which made him feel very uncomfortable. The concubine asked if he came by the night train and said hurriedly, "Second young master, come and lean over here. I haven't rested since we got off the train." She put him on a sofa chair by the window, and Shijin took it easily, picked up a newspaper and read it. Mrs. Shen sat on a chair in front of Xiaotong's bed, and the room was quiet. There was a child downstairs who started crying, and my concubine's mother called up from downstairs, "Auntie, please come and hug him." The concubine was squeezing orange water with a small glass grinder, and she muttered, "An old man and a young man are killing me." The old man is also nagging. Just like the orange water, others squeeze it and it becomes dirty. She was busy going in and out, and after a while, an old woman brought a large plate of fried noodles and 2 pairs of bowls and chopsticks. The concubine followed behind and smiled as she asked her to eat noodles with the second young master. Zhen said, "I'm not hungry. I just ate at home." The concubine repeatedly said, "Eat less." Seeing that his mother was not moving the chopsticks and he was not eating, Zhen seemed a little embarrassed, so he had to help him up. "Come eat some with chopsticks." His father was lying on the bed, just watching him eat, as if he felt a kind of simple satisfaction, and a smile appeared on his lips. Zhen was eating the greasy fried noodles next to his father's hospital bed, but he felt a strange and miserable feeling in his heart. The concubine ordered a separate table to be opened for lunch for Mrs. Shen and the second young master to eat in the master's room. Zhen sat in that room for a whole day. Mrs. Shen wanted to ask him to go home early and rest, but Xiaotong said, "Zhen will stay here today." When the concubine heard this, she was very reluctant, because he smiled and said, "Hey, we don't even have a good bed. I wonder if the second young master can get used to sleeping on it." Xiaotong pointed to the small iron bed where his concubine slept, and his concubine said, "Just sleep in this room." "Ha, you asked for tea and water at night, and you didn't exhaust the second young master. He can't get used to doing these things either." Xiaotong said nothing. The concubine looked at his face and could only smile and said, "Well, if anything happens, second young master, please call someone, and I will sleep more alertly." The concubine led the maid to remove the bedding from her bed. She slept in the same bed with the 2 children, put another bedding on Zhen, and said, "The second young master has no choice but to sleep on this small bed, but the quilts are all newly nailed and are still clean." The light shone on the apple green walls. Zhen was sleeping in this couple's room, which was very affectionate. He felt very strange as to why he was here. My concubine came in countless times throughout the night, asking for help, serving Xiaotong to drink tea, take medicine, and defecate. Zhen felt very dissatisfied because he spent the night here, causing her to lose a lot of steps. When he opened his eyes and took a look, she smiled and said, "Second young master, please don't move. Let me do it. I'm used to it." She was bleary-eyed, her bun was hairy from sleep, and her cheongsam was unbuttoned, exposing the red silk plaid blouse inside. Zhen simply didn't dare to look at her because he suddenly remembered the story of Fang Yiding. She might be trying to create an opportunity to falsely accuse him of molesting her. He had developed this concept since he was a child, and he always felt that this concubine was a scheming evil person. Thinking about it later, she was probably worried about the iron box in the corner of the room, fearing that there might be some secret exchange between father and son, so she kept coming here to check it out. Mrs. Shen went back that day because she felt that Zhen had a poor appetite and thought he wouldn't be able to eat the food in the small mansion. When she came the next day, she brought some vegetarian goose and lettuce dumplings made at home. This lettuce dumpling is made very delicately. The lettuce is marinated and plated into a long piece into a dark green pancake with a red dried rose stuffed on top. She smiled at Zhen and said, "Yesterday you were having breakfast at home. I saw you ate 2 in a row. I thought you might like them." Xiaotong wanted to eat too when he saw it. He ate porridge, and it was even more suitable to eat this kind of pickled vegetables. He ate it with gusto and said, "I haven't eaten anything like this in years." My aunt was very angry after hearing this. Xiaotong has been in much better spirits these past 2 days. Once, the cashier came. Although Xiaotong was ill, he still had to ask about many things in business, and he had to ask for his advice on some matters. Because he is the only one who has a clear account, and he has the entire set of figures clearly remembered in his mind. The accountant bowed and sat in front of the bed, very close to him, and Zhao Tong explained everything to him in a very subtle voice. After the accountant left, Zhen said, "Dad, I don't think you should bother yourself like this. If the doctor knows about it, he must speak up." Zhao Tong sighed and said, "I really can't let go. What's wrong with me?" Solution: only after I got sick did I realize that everything was fake, and none of the people I used were trustworthy. Zhen knew that he had this temper, and if he continued to persuade him, he would only make him complain more. He would simply say that as long as he had one breath left in his body today, he would have to sacrifice his life. Otherwise, what would these people in his family eat? In fact, how did he end up in such a miserable state? It seems that the whole family relies on him to make food and feed him every day. He just suffered from the common problem of ordinary businessmen. He is too obsessed with money and puts all his energy on it, so he always thinks about it. The telephone in his small mansion was installed in the bedroom, and Zhen listened to the phone twice for him. One time when he had to deal with something, he said to Zhen, "You can go there." Mrs. Shen smiled and said, "Can he succeed?" Zhao Tong smiled and said, "After all, he has been hanging around outside. If you can't handle these things, how about that?" Zhen ran errands for his father twice in succession. His father didn't say anything to her face, but praised him behind his back to his mother. "He's quite careful. He's thoughtful." Mrs. Shen happily related to Zhen when she got the chance. Zhen was originally an outsider in these matters, and he was not very familiar with the ways of the world. When he was in Shanghai, he suffered from this, so his popularity in the factory was not very good, and he was often troubled by this. But here, because he is Shen's son, everyone supports him, and he feels very comfortable doing things, and of course he feels very happy. Gradually, everything happened to him. If Mr. Accountant wanted to ask the master for advice on something, Zhao Tong smiled proudly and said, "Ask the second young master. It's under his control now. I don't care, go and ask him." Zhen suddenly became an important person now. As soon as the concubine's mother saw him, she said, "Second young master, you have lost weight in the past 2 days. Thank you for your hard work. The second young master is so filial." The concubine also said, "Second young master is here, master. It's much better, otherwise he would be worried all day long." My aunt's mother said again, "Second young master, don't be polite. Just say whatever you want. Our aunt has always been anxious and confused, and she doesn't take good care of her." Mother and daughter. As soon as the hand was handed over, the second young master was long, and the second young master was short, but secretly there was a panic. The aunt and her mother said, "The old man is going to die now. It's too late. Everything in the store has been taken care of by others. No wonder they say businessmen have no conscience. They only recognize their sons except for money. Isn't it right? Like he has been a couple for more than 10 years. But he has no plans for me at all." Her mother said, "I said don't be angry. Just use some soft skills with him. To be honest, he has always been pretty good to you. He is quite afraid of you. That year he went to Shanghai to play as a dancing girl, so you just made trouble with him. Wouldn't it be fine?" But this time the matter was a bit tricky. After much deliberation, the concubine decided that she could only use her children to impress him. That day she brought her youngest boy into Zhao Tong's room, smiling. "I keep asking me to see my daddy." "Oh, daddy is here. Didn't you say you missed your daddy?" That child, I don't know why, but I suddenly felt awkward and stood in front of Zhao Tong's bed, just lowering my head and grabbing the sheets. Zhao Tong reached out and touched his face, but felt sad. People after middle age often have this feeling of loneliness. They feel that when they open their eyes, there are all people relying on them. But there is no one they can rely on, not even anyone they can discuss with, so he relied heavily on Zhen. Zhen had long wanted to go back to Shanghai. He secretly told his mother what he meant, and her mother reluctantly asked him to stay for a few more days. Zhen also felt that his father's illness was getting better and he could not give him such a blow. So he didn't mention leaving. He just said he wanted to stay at home. Living in a small mansion is really awkward. There are other things to follow. The first is that the environment for reading and writing letters is too bad. Manzan's letters were sent to his home, and his mother brought them here one after another. But he was never able to write a long letter to her properly. Zhen told his father that he wanted to move back home. His father nodded and said, I also want to live there. The area there is quiet and it is more suitable for recuperation. He looked at his concubine again. He said, she always gets up early and goes to bed late. She is also tired and sick. I want her to have a good rest. The concubine had a cough because she caught a cold at night. She also guarded against thieves day and night. The old man handed the things in the iron box to Zhen. A person's energy is limited and he can't take care of them. Suddenly she heard the old man say that he was moving away. She looked pale and said nothing. Mrs. Shen was also stunned. After a pause, she smiled and said, you are just right. Aren't you afraid of being too tired? Xiao Tong said, that's okay. I'll call a car later and Zhen and I will go back together. Mrs. Shen smiled and said, go back today. Xiao Tong had actually had this intention for a long time and didn't dare to say it out yet, fearing that his concubine would make trouble for him. Then she smiled and said, are you able to make it today? Why don't you go back first and ask them to clean up the house, and we'll come back later. Mrs. Shen agreed, but she looked at Zhen, and both of them were thinking, I'm not sure whether I can leave or not. After Mrs. Shen left, the concubine sneered and said, Humph, you said it so nicely. You told me to take a rest. After saying this, her eyes became red. Xiao Tong just closed his eyes, looking very tired. Seeing that Zhen was like this, it was inevitable that there would be a quarrel, and he would be caught in it. It would be inconvenient for him, so he immediately walked out, went downstairs, and pretended to ask Li Sheng to buy an evening newspaper. The servants were all whispering there, chattering nervously. Probably they already knew the news that the master was moving away. Zhen was pacing back and forth in the guest room, and heard the maids shouting from a distance, the master's name is Li Sheng. Li Sheng went to buy newspapers for the second young master. After a while, Li Sheng came back and put when the newspaper was delivered to the living room. A maid followed up and said, the master is calling you. I want you to call for a car. After hearing this, Zhen couldn't help but become nervous. The car seemed to be arriving very slowly. He read an evening newspaper upside down 2 or 3 times before he heard the car horn. Li Sheng said to a maid outside, go up and tell me. The maid said, why don't you go and tell me? You called me. Li Sheng said seriously, go, tell me. What are you afraid of? The two of them pushed me and I pushed you, but neither of them dared to go. In the end, Li Sheng ran into the guest room, lowered his hands and reported, second young master, the car is here. Zhen remembered that he still had some clothes and odds and ends in his father's room and needed to tidy them up, so he went back upstairs. Before I could reach the door of the room, I heard my concubine shouting from inside. What do you think? Take these things out and prepare to take them all away. That's not possible. Are you going to throw our wives away? No, you're not going to. Are you back? Didn't you raise these children? Xiao Tong's voice was also very urgent and said, I'm not dead yet. Where am I? Of course I have to put my things there. Just for convenience, said the wife. Lunchbox. Let me tell you, it's not this lunchbox. Then he heard a grabbing sound, and then a loud bang. Zhen was really startled, thinking that if his father fell down again, the third time if you have a second stroke, there is no hope. He could no longer stay out of it, so he hurriedly walked into the room and saw that it was okay. His father was sitting on the sofa, panting, and said, Are you going to piss me off or something? The iron box was open, and the stocks, passbooks, and warehouse receipts were open. It was scattered all over the floor, and probably just now he was tremblingly going to open the iron box to get something. His concubine got anxious and started tugging with him. He fell forward, but luckily he didn't fall, but pushed a chair to the ground. The concubine's face was so frightened that her face turned yellow, and she still insisted on saying, Then think about it for yourself. Are you worthy of me? I have been ill in these days, and I have not been attentive to you. If you leave just as soon as you say, you are such a bully, She twisted round and sat down, leaning on the back of the chair and sobbing. Her mother also came in at this time, patted her shoulder and persuaded her. "Don't be so stubborn. It's not like I won't come back after I leave." Silly girl. Of course, this was meant for him, indicating that her daughter was very fond of him. She loved him passionately, but since her aunt came to snatch stocks and bank books, Zhao Tong also felt a little chilled. While the room was in chaos, he shouted, "Mother Zhou, Mother Wang, is the car coming? Why didn't you tell me it was coming? Damn it, help me out quickly." Zhen gathered his things first. After taking a few things, he followed behind, walked downstairs, and got into the car together. Back home, Mrs. Shen never expected that they would arrive so early. The house was not ready yet, so she had to ask the driver and maids to help the master go upstairs and help him lie down. Mrs. Shen gave up her own bed. He slept and built another camp bed. "I didn't take all the medicine with me, so I invited a doctor to come and prescribe new medicines." They also prepared snacks for Zhen and prepared a particularly sumptuous dinner. The house is used to being quiet, but the servants have never experienced these things, and they all seem to be in a hurry. The eldest young lady only followed her mother-in-law, but she was so busy that her hair was disheveled and her throat was hoarse. This scene of father's return may have some desolate meaning, but in the end, it was spent in a hurry. In the evening, Zhen had gone to bed, and Mrs. Shen came to his room again. Mother and son had not been able to say a word to each other these days. Mrs. Shen asked him carefully about what happened before he left, but Zhen didn't tell her about his father's almost fall, fearing that she would be frightened. Mrs. Shen smiled and said, "I didn't dare to tell you even though I was holding it back. As soon as you said you wanted to move back, I thought to myself, your father is so kind to you now, and that woman is getting angry in her eyes. You are so as soon as you walk away, you might kill the old man." Zhen smiled and said, "That's not a big deal, right?" Xiao Tongju is back, for Mrs. Shen. This is really a blessing from heaven, and it is entirely due to her son's strength. You can imagine how proud she is. He has come back, and he has always treated her like this. There is no way to get back together again, but no matter what, he cannot refuse her care while he is ill, and she is very satisfied. Strangely enough, when a new patient like this was added to the family, he immediately became lively. Many calligraphy and paintings that had been kept in boxes were taken out and hung, and the large carpet was taken out and laid out, and new curtains were made, because Mrs. Shen said that since the master came back, guests often come to visit, so she cannot not arrange in a decent manner. Zhao Tong had to favorite antique furnishings, which he had left behind in the small mansion. He missed them very much, so he sent a servant to get them, but his concubine was angry with him and refused to give them to him. Zhao Tong lost his temper, threw a teacup, slapped the bed and cursed, "You bastards! It's impossible to ask you to do such a thing. Just say I want to take it. How dare she not give it to me?" It was Mrs. Shen who tried to persuade her again and again. He said, "Don't be angry about this little thing. It's too much. Didn't the doctor tell you not to be anxious?" This set of fine porcelain teacups was given to her as a dowry. She has been reluctant to use it. She only recently took it out for use. Xiao Jian smashed one, and now he smashed another. Mrs. Shen smiled and said, "I will tell the fortunes of the remaining few." Because Xiao Tong once praised her lettuce dumplings, Mrs. Shen made a lot of pickles this year, including bamboo shoots, beans, sausages, fragrant tripe, and pickled vegetables with gluten. The Chinese New Year is still far away at this time, but she is already planning to celebrate the Chinese New Year this year. He also used money to make new blue cloth coats for all the servants. Zhen had never seen her so happy. Almost all his life, he has seen his mother with a melancholy face. No matter how much she cries and sheds tears, he is used to seeing her and can be indifferent to her. On the contrary, he feels miserable when he looks at her current expression of extreme happiness. As for my aunt, my father may not be here anymore. Of course, we still have to meet in the future. As soon as they meet, the other side will inevitably use their ability to sow discord, and the other side will become indifferent again. It would be better if Zhen was in Nanjing. It seems that his father is indispensable now. My father must be disappointed that he is gone. His mother kept persuading him not to leave and to quit the Shanghai business. He had never considered resigning. But recently he has been thinking about this issue often. If he really resigned, it would be a big blow to Manzin. She attaches great importance to his future and is willing to endure hardships for his career. But now he has given up on his own initiative, as it seems too unjustifiable. How can he be worthy of others? He was originally looking forward to Manzin's letter, but now he was almost afraid of seeing her letter.
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.